So glad you can join us again for our study through the book of Ecclesiastes. We got a chance on Tuesday to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1 to kind of introduce ourselves to the main argument of the preacher, to talk a little bit about this idea of Havel, of the vanity of vanities, and talk about how the preacher begins to discuss this idea. And so that continues on into chapter 2 of the book, where he's going to continue to kind of test these things and see if he can find some sense of meaning in the various aspects of life. And so we're going to go ahead and dive right on in here into chapter 2. And so starting in chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes and verse 1, the preacher says, "I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted them in all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasures of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil that I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun." So we see here the preacher begins to kind of, he's talked in chapter 1 a little bit about the idea of wisdom and considering these various things. And so now in chapter 2, he's going to start talking a little bit more about some of the physical things before he gets back into wisdom. And so he talks about this idea that he essentially goes through a test. He decides to test whether physical pleasure, whether the good things of the world are able to bring him this. And so he goes through what any man would consider the height of success. I mean, he builds great buildings and he accumulates wealth, and he's surrounded by, gold and silver and growing things. And he basically says, I became great. I surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. I made it to the top of the mountain. I made it so that nobody else like me existed. And so he's basically led what any, purely secular, purely worldly person would say, like, man, that guy had it all. He had everything he could possibly want. And yet his conclusion is that it's still Havel. It's still this striving after the wind, this smoke that he couldn't grasp. And even though he had found everything that he could take pleasure in, everything that he could enjoy, it didn't give him the answers that he was seeking. It didn't answer this enigma of the purpose of life. And he's going to continue to expand on this idea a little bit later in the chapter. But Greg, what do you see here in the text of this kind of exploration of the physical?
I think it's both relatable and yet a little bit unrelatable for us. And so I want to kind of combine those two. It's unrelatable in the sense that if I want to go and just try to enjoy life to the fullest, my YOLO moment, I don't get to just have built gardens and vineyards, because when I plant stuff, it dies. Some people have a green thumb. I have a black thumb. That's what happens. It is a curse of death, except for weeds. I have a very green thumb when it comes to weeds. But I can't just go out and do all this. I can't hire everybody, maybe for like an hour, but not any longer than that, on all these musicians and everybody else. And so we kind of view this and we say, well, this person's just kind of completely giving into worldliness, and all they're doing is diving off the deep end and just finding joy and stuff. Well, there's a sense in which that's true. He is trying to find joy. This is part of his test. Is there satisfaction? Right? Going back to chapter 1, there was this problem. My eyes could not be satisfied. My ears could not be filled. So what does he do? Well, he takes care of his eyes. He takes care of his ears. He tries all these kind of worldly things. And of course, there's not going to be any satisfaction there. But here's the relatable part. I might not be able to afford all that, but I can do something like he does and say, I'm going to live for now. Or maybe not even just in an outright way, like I'm going to ignore God. Just simply, I get caught up in the everyday hustle and bustle of this life. I try to say, well, where's the meaning? Maybe if I can get that promotion, if my family can get X amount in the bank account, then it'll be okay. And God takes care of us. God grants us what we need. But when we try to do it without him in the picture, there starts to be a little bit of a a tug of war there on us. We have to put God first always, and we have to make sure that realize that if we have blessings, who are they from? Well, they're from God, and we need to do something with that. And that's what's interesting here, as you're going to see as he goes through, that no matter what he tried, no matter how many riches he accumulated or poured into projects, there still was no joy in Mudville, as they might say. There's all is still vanity. Trey, I think one of the interesting things he lays out here is in this search, it's kind of this, well, certainly this could work, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, you see this optimism from the preacher as he kind of looks to this as Andrew's talked about in the introduction. He looked at wisdom, and now he's kind of going a different route. And he says, "In my heart, come now." And there's sort of this excitement. This is going to work. This is going to fulfill me. And in so doing, he kind of invites us to consider that with him. Yeah, maybe this is it. Maybe this is what is going to satisfy. But very quickly, all is vanity, he says. And he is looking at God's good world, at the things that he has made, and he's indulging in those things. And typically when we hear the word indulging, we tend to think only negative. And while there's certainly a negative sense to that, there's also a sense in which God did give us things to delight in. And so is delighting in these things, is it going to be an answer? And at least up front here, what he says is, no, I've given myself over completely and entirely to these things. I've sought these things out. I have climbed the ladder as high as I can climb. I have spun my wheels, all, as it were, sort of in this rat race of life. And what I have found, whether it's money, whether it's accomplishments and prestige or whatever else it is, what he's found is that it really doesn't satisfy. It leaves him with that burning question and that sense of enigma with everything, that he just can't make sense out of it all. And so he even talks about wisdom here, how he did these things with wisdom. His wisdom remained with him, verse 9. And I think part of what we're to do as we look at this is to consider, is he really looking at everything, or his eyes as open as he is claiming that they are? And so he's gonna dive in verses 12 and following to consider wisdom. I'll go ahead and read that if that's all right. Verse 12 of chapter 2, it says, "So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can man do? For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. And then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise, as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all will have long been forgotten. How the wise dies, just like the fool, so I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and a striving after the wind." One of the things that we see here, and this is sort of a throwback to chapter 1, where he's already explored kind of the cyclical nature of life, and that everything just kind of goes in these cycles, and until it doesn't, right? And that's when we come to the point of death, and that's sort of the stop on all of this, and the stop on the search. He's been searching and trying to find an answer, and here it all comes to an end when we meet the point of death. And the sad thing, the tragic thing about that is that it comes both to the wise and to the fool. And so he starts to wonder, well, is there really anything good about wisdom? And they ultimately both end in the same place. And so he ends in this place of despair. Gass, you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see is really interesting here is that he makes the point in verse 13 that I saw that there's more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there's more gain in light than in darkness. So he doesn't want to try, I don't think he's making the point to the reader that, well, it just doesn't matter if you're wise or foolish, there's no point in either one. he makes the point that clearly wisdom is better than folly, just like light is able to illuminate where darkness can't. And so he believes in the power of wisdom. He believes that wisdom is a good thing. So we certainly shouldn't, as readers, walk away and be like, oh, wisdom just doesn't matter. That would invalidate almost all of the Bible. The Bible makes it clear wisdom is important. The problem that he has, though, is that even with wisdom, you still die. And you still die just like the foolish person. And so while wisdom is vital, while wisdom is very important, he's going to talk more about that throughout the rest of the text. He's frustrated and he's grieved. He hates life because he doesn't see what is the answer to this idea of Havel? What is this answer to satisfaction? And so wisdom, while it's vital, while it's important, it has its limitation. Its limitation is that it doesn't answer all of these questions that we have. And so certainly wisdom has a great benefit, but it's not the end of the discussion. So Greg, what do you see here in these verses?
I think one of the interesting components to this search for does wisdom satisfy? Well, no, not in this ultimate perfect way. Does foolishness or folly or ignorance satisfy? Well, no, certainly not in this satisfied, complete way. This is verse 16. In the earlier verses, he's basically done all he can. And he says, I'm going to accumulate things. I'm going to accumulate entertainment. I'm going to try basically anything this world can offer. And ultimately, those things, those experiences aren't sufficient for him. Then he tries even wisdom, but verse 16 is relatable again. For of the wise as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten, how the wise dies just like the fool. There's a couple basic points. Number one is both wise and foolish will die. And that's sad on one front, but realistic. The second one is that, living for a reputation doesn't work either. And we understand that people live, and I wonder how many people could name all of our presidents, just to give an example. And that's a pretty important worldly person, worldly rank. But really in verse 16, the challenge for me, I think a challenge I see that's very application heavy in this chapter is to say, what am I living for? Because it's pretty easy sometimes for us, especially if we don't consider ourselves high on the economic chain, to say, well, I would never do what he did in verses 1 through 8 because I couldn't. I don't have the resources. I would never, degrade myself into living for worldly pleasure. Well, whether or not that's what he did, we kind of look at it that way. Here's the problem, though. How much do I care about what other people think of me? This is a problem as you come in the New Testament. There were Jews who understood who Jesus was, but were fixated on appearance. And what did that keep them from doing? Well, for example, in John 12, 42 and 43, there were Jews who believed in Jesus, but they cared more about the opinion of men and the threats that would be upon them, so they didn't confess him. All right, well, you say in verse 16, what is the problem? Well, all will be forgotten. What lasts, though? Well, my soul lasts. I'm going to go to a judgment. Of course, this is going to be the conclusion of the matter, to fear God and keep his commandments. Why? Because only living for God makes anything worthwhile. God puts enjoyment in our work. That is the enjoyment that we get, going back even to a verse like verse 10. He allows music to have a purpose to touch our souls. He allows us to enjoy the fruits of our labor, to eat and drink, and to have some wisdom. But as you look at that, the joy has to be in, I'm doing this on behalf of God. I'm doing this because of God. Otherwise, it's vanity. It's going to disappear. And when I die, that's it. Only one thing lives forever, and that's our soul. The question is, what will we do with it? I think, Trey, as we look at this section, and as you're reading that, it really stands out, this idea that on any extreme, wisdom and foolishness, it just doesn't compute. And I think that theme is continued. I'm going to read verse 18 to 23 and get you in there to see this continuing idea. In verse 18, I hated all my toil, in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What is a man from all the toil and the striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. Try to talk about that continuing theme he has and how it's really getting to him here.
Yeah, I think, again, he's looking in all these different arenas to see which of them is going to bring satisfaction, which of them is going to bring fulfillment. And all of these by themselves are insufficient. I think that's ultimately where he's coming to. And when we make one thing our sole pursuit and our sole goal, our sole aim, whether it is the good things of this life, whether it is something like wisdom, which is good in and of itself, but doesn't quite answer all the questions of life, whether it is something like our toil and our God-given labor. That's really the programmatic question that he begins with back in chapter 1 and verse 3. What is the point of all the toil? What's the point of all that I do in this life and all the work that I find to do with my hands? What's the point of all of that? And if the point is just to continue working so that you might continue gaining, so that you might continue having, and if that's all you're ever seeking, you're never going to be satisfied. You are going to be full of sorrow. You're going to be vexed in heart and then not able to rest at all, because all you're doing is seeking after more and more. And that's never going to be a path of satisfaction. I think about passages like Psalm chapter 37 and verse 4, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. And I think so many times that it's so easy for me. And again, Greg, you mentioned earlier that in some ways this character is almost unrelatable because he's got so many avenues that he can seek and pursue after. And I don't have all those avenues available to me. And yet I can certainly look at my life and see instances in which I have, even apart from all of the wealth and all of the stature that this man may have had, I have sought these things and I have put my trust in them, and ultimately they leave me feeling empty. And so I think the writer may turn here in just a little bit to point to something else. But before we get there, Gass, did you have any thoughts on 18 through 23?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating where he goes with this, where he talks about this idea of the work being a vexation. So often we think of work as the ultimate fulfillment of it. We think of work as one of the things that really defines us, one of the things that is so essential to our character. And yet I think this idea of succession is fascinating. The idea that you may do everything right, you may be successful, you may be incredible at the job that you do, and you may even you may die a success, you may die having done everything right, and yet that's not going to stop some nincompoop from following up and ruining everything through no fault of your own. The next person may take your business and shatter it into a million pieces, and there's no control over that. And so even if you do everything right, there's no guarantee of a lasting legacy, that you may never be remembered for what you do. And so I think it'd be easy to look at this really pessimistically and again say like, well, there's no point in work, why even bother with that? And he's going to come to actually the opposite conclusion, which is interesting. But the author or the preacher is really trying to get us to understand the perspective that death is a big deal, that death is kind of this terrible great equalizer, that it's all going to end. You can't take it with you, is the old cliche saying. And it doesn't matter what you've done. You can't take the wealth of a Solomon-like figure that we see at the beginning of the chapter, and you can't take the failures of an impoverished individual. So it doesn't matter where you fall on the spectrum. There's no lasting legacy here. And I think it's a really fascinating outlook here, but it's surprising even more the conclusion that he's going to come to. Greg, what do you think about that?
When Paul says in Colossians 3 to set your mind on things above, we understand that we need to be, meditating on good things. We need to think about God, but really look at this perspective he has in 20 and 21. This can be a real plague on us. This can really drag me down. The idea that I can think of myself as somebody doing the right things. And let's even give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that this isn't a statement of pride, because this person did have wisdom. But in verse 21, I'm going to have wisdom and knowledge and skill, and I have to leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who doesn't deserve it. There's this problem of deserving, and this is the problem of this life and that equalizer in death. The problem is, as long as you search for meaning in front of your eyes, in front of our face, our eyes will not be satisfied, our ears will not be filled. There is no way that you can look at something in this life only and find satisfaction, find peace, find joy. Yeah, in John 21, Jesus has this conversation with Peter, and we remember often that he asked, "Do you love me?" 3 times. But after that, he tells Peter, basically, "You're going to die for me." And Peter's response isn't, "Oh, well, that's really tough to bear. That's going to be difficult." It's, "Well, what about John?" And Jesus says, "You follow me." This person is relatable, and I appreciate him sharing his journey for us, but I can see a lot of pitfalls in myself in him here in chapter 2. If I keep looking at what other people do and don't deserve, this is someone who verse 21 says they don't deserve it. They didn't work for it. Right? Well, what does that matter? Because when my life is over, when that equalizer of death has come, it doesn't matter if I deserved it or if they deserved it. It's gone. We have to lay up treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. That's a different perspective, to say, what does God want from me in this life versus how can I find meaning myself in this life? It's an interesting balance. And what he finds in this next section is that there is a balance. There is an answer, both spiritually, yes, but also physically now. And that balance is going to be one of the keys to, as we've talked about, I think before, and certainly alluded to, the idea of the keys to Ecclesiastes. Let me go ahead and finish reading 24 through 26. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw as from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. Interesting applications here, Trey. What do you see? What pops out?
One of the things here that kind of, for me at least, sets this apart from maybe what we've got in the first 23 verses is that God has mentioned here several times where before he's not. And so maybe what we're seeing is that there is a way of approaching life, even enjoying the good things that God has given us, but maybe not appreciating or delighting in them as gifts from him. And yet what we see here at the end is God has given these things. These are part of the good creation that he has made. And so something that we kind of alluded to earlier, and I think even the quotation from Psalm 37 verse 4 was getting to this direction, that when I work and when I labor, I need to enjoy what I have. But I do want to pick up on something Gass talked about, and that is, by the way, Andrew is Gass. We call him that, Andrew Gass. Anyway,
3 for 3 studies so far. Okay. You've done
it. Probably going to do it all of them. But anyway, one of the things that we need to not get caught up in is just this idea that work is the God that we serve, that work is the ultimate purpose of our being and our existence. And Gass, I think you used the word identity. I think that's a really great way to look at it. Part of the reason why we work is so that we can take time to rest and to delight and to enjoy. That's exactly what you see. It's patterned after God's own work in creation, that he takes time to rest from his labor, but there's more going on in that. He's also enjoying it and he's delighting in it. And that's what we are called to do as well. So we can't allow work to become this, something that it's not, something that we just spend all of our time, all of our effort, all of our energy in. And I know that sounds very un-American of me to say, but I think part of what the Ecclesiastes writer is doing is not only challenging their ancient worldviews, but also challenging our own worldview, which at times has a lot of overlap, where we define ourselves by what we do. And if that's what we do, rather than taking a moment to step back and thank God for what he's given us throughout the process, and even the process itself, I think we're going to find ourselves in that verse 23 of being full of sorrow and having our work be a vexation. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on this last section?
Yeah, it's interesting to see how he's drawn these comparisons, and he's made the point that, wisdom is better than folly, but it still doesn't answer all of our questions. He makes the point that working, especially working with the hand of God and working through the Lord, working to the glory of the Lord, that's also good. That's a good thing to do. But he still ends this conclusion, almost surprisingly. He's ended every section with, this also is vanity and a striving after wind. And so I think the point that the author is wanting us to take is that there are good things to do. There's not a lack of answers. There's no reason to despair completely. And I think a lot of times, we talked about this in our introduction, a lot of people come to these same conclusions. Even secular philosophers and authors have come to that conclusion that, there's no point. And they take a very nihilistic viewpoint of, well, then nothing matters. That's not what Koheleth is saying. That's not what the preacher is saying. He's saying there are still things that are good to do. It's still good to be wise. It's still good to work hard, and it's still good to enjoy the good things of this life. But he also doesn't try to shield us from the reality that doesn't change, that there's still difficult aspects. There are still enigmas and frustrating queries. Death is still a reality. There's still going to be injustice, as we're going to see later on. There's still the elements of chance, and terrible luck can occur. So there's good for us to do. And that's kind of where we're starting to build ultimately through this entire book to that conclusion we're going to see in chapter 12 of fear God and keep his commandments. We're seeing those seeds be laid here that yes, there is a right way to live. But that right way is still not going to give all the answers. That right way is still in some capacities Havel. And remember, Havel is not a bad thing. Havel is not, oh, that's sinful or oh, that's pointless. Havel just means it's still an enigma. It's still a question. It's still kind of confusing. And so that's kind of the major point that I think is worth, one of the major points that's worth taking here, is that Koheleth does think there are good things for us to do, but we shouldn't think that that's going to clear all of the confusion of life. Greg, you got some thoughts about that?
I think this section is powerful because in a chapter like chapter 2, where there is so much negativity, right? When we read this, we tend to not give him the benefit of the doubt when it comes to drinking wine, accumulating concubines, those kinds of things, whether he deserves it or not. This chase of wisdom and folly that he ends in verse 17, so I hated life. And then, of course, this next section, well, I'm going to die and my stuff's going to go to somebody who doesn't deserve it. It's like negative, negative, negative. But there's basically 2 sections of positivity, and this is the biggest. There's one mentioned in verse 10. After all the stuff trying, after all the entertainment trying in verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept from my heart no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Right? And then, of course, you come to verse 24 and 25. This also I saw is from the hand of God. What is that? Enjoyment in his toil. Now, there's nothing good about just working. Right? Because just working itself with no end, you'd say, well, what's the point? But if God puts something there, there is a power. Right? I can go out into my yard and do work, and just because I chose that doesn't mean there's enjoyment, but God seemingly has placed it there. This also I saw is from the hand of God. That's what this writer concludes in 24. And even in 25, apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? By this idea that we need God. And we're going to get to an application section in a moment. But as you think about this section, really we see this idea of the problem of idolatry, the idolatry for us of happiness. We think in this life the idea is happiness. And this is really what he does in chapter 2. How can I be happy? How can I stop wanting more? Well, those are different questions than how can I have a life that pleases God? It's different than what life does God want for me? Because if you look, a lot of his servants didn't have a happy, materialistic life. And so, of course, that wouldn't work. And some of his greatest servants were people that we would never pick. In fact, if you look at the apostles as an example, or even a judge like Gideon, these are not the people we say, these are going to be God's shining examples. But God can place power in people because he is the ultimate authority and power himself. So, Trey, why don't we go ahead and start wrapping up with our application here? What do you see in chapter 2 before you pitch it over to Gass and I to conclude out our study today?
Yeah, I want to dive in on a particular in that pursuit of happiness that I know certainly is true for me and probably for many of our listeners, and that is the pursuit of happiness through consumerism, and just trying to get more stuff. And when we get, new iPhone comes out, we get the new iPhone, we get the new watch, we get the new whatever, and we think, okay, that's going to satisfy, that's going to please me. And I think part of what we see in this honest struggle of the preacher here is that, well, at the end of the day, it's not going to give you exactly what you're thinking it will, at least not if you're pursuing it as the thing is going to be the end and the be all and it's going to satisfy. And so I just think about how easy it is to get wrapped up in wanting more and seeking more and being discontent. I mean, listen, we've all got Amazon, or at least access to Amazon. Many of us are Prime members. It's just one click away to be able to purchase something. And it's so easy. And I wonder if we don't need to do some more of what he does there in verses 24 and 25, where he steps back, takes a look at things and realizes, okay, these things are from God, and enjoys the things as they have been given rather than always seeking the next best thing, the next bigger thing, the next more expensive, more on brand, whatever else it is. And so create and build into our lives, we need to build into our lives moments where we can stop and be content with what God has given us. I think contentment really is the answer to consumerism, just knowing that this is given from God. And I think that's going to go a long way if we take those intentional pauses to say, God has given me this. I can delight in this and be thankful for this. And then maybe I won't have eyes that are necessarily looking at the next biggest, best, brightest, whatever thing that's coming on down the line. Andrew, do you have any thoughts of application on this chapter?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the preacher and again the author who's kind of compiling these things really wants us to understand is that this teacher figure is almost kind of presenting us the case of like, listen, I've done everything you're going to try. I've done it way more than you had the capacity to. Like I think it was Greg who made the comment earlier. I can't just go build a whole bunch of gardens and palaces and everything. And so I think sometimes there's a temptation to think like, okay, well, if I just had more, if I just had a little bit more, if I had a little bit more stuff, or if I had a little bit more knowledge, if I had a little bit more time, maybe I could figure all of this out. Maybe I could work through these things and I could find that satisfaction on my own. And the preacher is almost like, no, stop. I did it already. I did it way more than you can do it. I found every single possible avenue of pleasure. I found every single possible avenue of wisdom. I did it all. It doesn't matter how much you get it. This isn't going to answer what you're looking for. And again, the point is not that, you shouldn't care, or you shouldn't be wise, or you shouldn't work hard. He's not saying that. But his point is that it doesn't matter. There's no hypothetical line that you can cross. And after this point of stuff, it's going to be satisfactory. It's going to answer all of your questions. It's going to answer the enigmas of life. There's no point where you're going to know enough, or you're going to be smart enough, you're going to be wise enough that you can say, okay, now I understand the enigmas of life. And I think that's a very humbling statement for us, that we should be able to say, I'm not going to understand it. There are some things that are beyond my capacity as a mortal human being to understand or to accomplish. So I'm not going to trust in myself. I'm not going to place my faith in myself and my wisdom or my accomplishments or my legacy or my wealth. I'm going to look for something that is more long-standing, which is ultimately what the root conclusion of this book is going to be. And so, the preacher kind of serves as almost like a person who says, okay, stop. Whatever you think you can do, I've already done it. It doesn't work that way. So let's just discard that and let's look at what can actually work. Greg, what are your thoughts?
I think chapter 2 comes down in a phrase or two or an idea. Are we going to treat the symptom or the disease? In chapter 2, he treats all kinds of symptoms for a lack of satisfaction, a lack of peace. Stuff won't do it. A little bit more wisdom won't do it. The opposite of wisdom won't do it. Working hard and accumulating won't do it. All right, we got to treat the disease. What's the hole in man? The hole in man is that God made us to be God-seeking. And there's always going to be a faith-shaped void if we choose to ignore that layer of faith. And as you look at chapter 2, there is that absence that Trey mentioned of God until basically the end of verse 24 and 25, albeit he is perhaps clarifying something from earlier. As you look at that, that tells me one thing. When I wake up each day, it can't be, how can I find peace? How can I create peace? How can I find joy? How can I be joyful? Those are symptoms. There are short-term things we can do. If you want to be happy or try to fill a void, go on Amazon, buy those pajamas, right? Get them put on your doorstep. Get the Apple Watch. That'll buy you some happiness for a moment, but it's a symptom. We need God. Every day I got to wake up and pray and be thankful for what God's done. That'll help me be content. I need to pray and seek out his word. That'll help me gain in wisdom. I need to realize that I need God and say, how does my life glorify God today? That will direct my thoughts and actions. Then I can go to bed and rest easy because I know my God is faithful, my God is fair, and there is a purpose in a life that seeks to please God. Chapter 2 is a wonderful chapter in showing us some things that don't work, but also realizing that even in the here and now, there are solutions. It is possible to have peace. It is possible to have purpose, and God is the center of that, as to be expected. Andrew, Trey, thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Another good study. Again, another application-filled study. A lot of good stuff for us all to think on. So again, thank you guys for both of you guys being in here.
All right. Y'all have a good day.
All right, absolutely. We will come in next week. Hopefully Tuesday is kind of the tentative plan, but we'll get into chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, and we will start our study there. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you again next week.